My name is Evan Blackwood. I'm 42 years old, a carpenter by trade, and I've always preferred quiet forests over busy streets. My mountain cabin was never just a house. It was the legacy my mother left behind, nestled high in the pines. It was the only thing she gave me before she passed, aside from her quiet strength and the warning, "Don't ever trust a man who's always smiling when he owes you something." I didn't understand what she meant until my phone rang one cold Thursday morning, and my stepfather, Martin, was on the line. "Sold the cabin," he said, almost casually, as if he were telling me he ran out of milk. "Had to. You know how these poker nights go." And then he laughed, a long, drawn-out laugh that echoed through the silence on my end. I didn't say a word. My hand tightened around the phone, but my voice didn't rise. I asked him for the paperwork, the signature, anything legal. "Don't worry," he chuckled. "It was still in my name, remember? Your mum never changed the deed." That's when the real betrayal sank in. Not just the loss of the cabin, but the realization that this man, who married my mother after my father passed, never saw me as anything but an obstacle to his self-indulgence. I had been maintaining that place for over a decade. Every shingle, every window pane was my handiwork. I poured my savings into its upkeep. I even cleared snow for the old neighbors during the winters, kept the garden alive through dry seasons, and hosted my sister and her kids every summer. I called it ours, but legally it had never been mine. And Martin had known that. He waited until the timing was right, until my job kept me busy out of town, until the market spiked, until he could make a quick sale behind my back. I didn't scream, I didn't threaten, I didn't drive down to confront him. What I did was hang up, walk out back, and sit by the broken oak bench I'd planned to restore next weekend. My mother's words rang loud in my mind. She had warned me of this, and in that moment, I understood. Martin had never been family. He had been a slow-moving storm, and now the damage was done. But the silence inside me wasn't defeat. It was calculation. If Martin thought I would just accept this loss, he clearly didn't know me. I wasn't a man who shouted. I was a man who built things carefully, quietly, and with a long memory. What he destroyed wasn't the end of my story. It was the start of a different kind of blueprint, one he wouldn't see coming. Oh, I didn't sleep that night, not because I was furious, but because the silence was louder than anything Martin had said. I sat by the old photo box my mother kept, thumbing through black and white memories, her standing in front of the cabin in the spring, snow melting behind her, sun on her face. That house was where I found myself again after my divorce. It was where I built my first hand-crafted table, where I healed, and now it had been handed off to some stranger for chips at a poker table. I thought about all the times I overlooked Martin's smirks, his subtle jabs about being the man of the house after my dad died. I remembered the way he always seemed to live on the edge, owing people, borrowing tools, making promises he never kept. My mother defended him, not because she was blind, but because she didn't want to spend her final years in conflict. She chose peace over truth. But now the truth had outlived her, and I was left holding its weight. Martin wasn't just reckless, he was calculated in his own cowardly way. He'd waited until I was out of state for work. He knew I wouldn't be watching. He knew the house was still in his name, because he convinced my mother not to change the deed. For tax reasons, he once claimed. I realized then how often manipulation wears a smile, how betrayal isn't always loud, it's often quiet, tucked into paperwork disguised as charm. It hurt, yes, but more than that, it rewired something in me. I stopped thinking of him as family and started seeing him for what he really was. A man who underestimated the wrong person. I wasn't looking for revenge out of rage. I was looking for restoration, and I would take back more than just the cabin. I would reclaim every piece of dignity he tried to gamble away. That next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through the cabin's legal documents. Every old filing box, every email, every notarized page I had stored digitally and in hard copy. I was looking for something specific. I wasn't sure what yet, but I knew Martin's kind. He wasn't careful, he was lazy, and lazy men leave gaps, loopholes, traces. The more I read, the more a strange calm settled over me. I found a folder I didn't remember scanning, a tax document where my mother had once designated me as the beneficiary for the cabin's maintenance trust. It was a small fund, barely anything, but that document listed me as a legal financial contributor tied to the property. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall Martin had built. A start. The next few weeks, I said nothing to Martin. No calls, no emails. I let the silence hang, like a storm cloud he couldn't predict. While he probably assumed I was sulking or grieving, I was building. I hired a real estate attorney, an old friend from high school named Clara, who owed me a favor for some custom woodwork I'd done for her lake house years ago. I didn't need to explain much. Just showed her the paperwork I'd found and asked one question. Can we reopen this? Clara's face shifted the moment she saw the trust designation. He made a mistake, she said. This isn't ironclad. If we can prove you've financially invested in the property, we can contest the sale. And if he lied to the buyers about ownership disputes, she paused, eyes gleaming, we might be able to unravel the whole thing. I nodded. That was all I needed. Not revenge. Just leverage. Quiet, elegant leverage. But I didn't stop there. I started asking around, neighbors near the cabin, friends from the local town council, even the previous owners who'd sold it to my mother. I learned that Martin hadn't just sold the cabin, he'd done it under questionable terms, rushed paperwork, a buyer who paid in cash, and more importantly, a missing disclosure about the trust and my financial involvement. The buyer had unknowingly stepped into a legal storm, and they were already trying to get out of it. Meanwhile, I paid a visit to the local records office. I stood in line, like anyone else, smiled politely, and reviewed the transaction history. What I found there made my stomach turn. Martin had undersold the property for quick cash. It was worth almost triple what he accepted. The buyer, likely a friend or quick-flip investor, hadn't even moved in. That told me one thing. This wasn't about the money. This was about power. Martin didn't just sell the house. He sold the symbol of my independence to remind me who he thought was in control. But here's the thing about control. It's an illusion built on secrets. And when you know where to look, the whole structure collapses. Clara filed a formal complaint with the local real estate board. A hearing was scheduled. Martin still had no idea. He thought I'd disappeared into grief. But what I was really doing was setting the table for the moment he'd realize. The man he thought was powerless had been holding the blueprints all along. By the end of that month, we received word from the buyer's legal team. They wanted out. They didn't want to be caught in a fraudulent deal. They didn't want to lose their license. They were willing to nullify the sale entirely, quietly, in exchange for an agreement not to pursue further legal action. Clara looked at me and asked, "Do you want the house back?" I didn't answer right away, because I realized I didn't just want the house. I wanted Martin to feel the absence of what he thought he controlled. I waited until the deal was officially reversed before contacting Martin. I wanted him to hear it, not as a warning, but as a consequence already delivered. I called him from the porch of the cabin, my cabin, on a rainy afternoon when the clouds hung low and the air smelled like pine and old promises. He picked up, his voice smug and casual as always. "Evan," he said, dragging my name like he owned it. "Come to gloat." "No," I said. Just thought you should know. The sale's been voided. The buyer's out, and the house is back in my name. There was silence. Long, sharp silence. You can check with the board, or your lawyer. If you still have one. I didn't need to say more. I could almost hear the sound of him blinking, calculating, realizing how far behind he was. He tried to laugh it off at first, tried to spin it as some kind of joke. But jokes don't work when the audience isn't laughing. A week later, I received a letter from Martin's attorney, blunt, defensive and panicked. He accused me of manipulation, said I'd gone behind his back, said I ruined his retirement plan. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He'd played his hand too early, and all his chips were dust now. What he thought would be a final victory turned into a quiet unraveling of everything he tried to steal. And the most painful part for him wasn't losing the house. It was realizing I didn't even need to raise my voice to take it back. News travels fast in small towns, and Martin's reputation began to corrode. People he owed money to started knocking harder. His poker friends disappeared. Even the local diner he used to swagger into every morning started serving him with silence. He tried to rebuild his image, to downplay what had happened, but no one bought it. He was no longer the man who outsmarted the system. He was the man who lost a cabin to the very person he underestimated. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I simply went back to the cabin and started rebuilding. The gutters needed work. The floorboards near the back window had swollen from last year's storm. I found old tools, old notes from my mother tucked into drawers. I worked with my hands again, quietly, steadily. Every nail I drove into the wood felt like a return, like reclaiming not just a home, but a version of myself I hadn't touched in years. Martin didn't call again. But I heard through my sister that he was trying to sell his truck, that he moved in with a friend 2 counties over, that he was for once quiet, and that was all I needed. Not an apology, not closure from his lips, just silence from the man who thought his betrayal would define my life. Instead, it only refined it. Winter came early that year, brushing the mountains with frost by October. I spent the colder nights in the cabin, wrapped in thick flannel and memory. The fire crackled softly as I read by lamplight, the same way my mother used to. There was no anger left in me, just space. Space to breathe, space to be. And outside that space, Martin's life was folding in on itself like a badly built house, quietly, slowly, but with the inevitability of rot. Word had gotten around that he'd defaulted on several debts. Some of the people he owed weren't polite about it. My sister called one night, voice low, asking if I'd spoken to him. "He's been sleeping in his car," she whispered. "He doesn't want anyone to know." I said nothing. I wasn't cold. I was just done warming people who burned me. I hung up the phone and sat with the weight of that knowledge. Martin had always seen himself as untouchable, but even pride has frostbite. I hadn't planned for his collapse. I didn't orchestrate it. But I also didn't save him from it. He had built his world on borrowed luck and empty charm. When the consequences came, they didn't knock. They walked right in. The house of cards he called a life came down without a storm, without drama, without fire, just gravity and silence. He sent me one letter, handwritten, sloppy, apologetic in a way that was more self-pity than remorse. "Guess I messed up," it said. "Didn't think you had it in you." That line sat with me. Not the apology, the confession of disbelief. Martin had underestimated me for decades. He mistook my quiet for weakness, my patience for passivity. He never understood that people who build things slowly also know how to dismantle things without noise. I didn't write back. Instead, I finished restoring the porch railing, repainted the shutters, repaired the roof before the snow set in. Every act of labor was a declaration, not of revenge but of renewal. I wasn't seeking to punish him. I was simply reclaiming what he tried to erase, and in doing so, I became something he never saw coming, whole. The cabin no longer felt haunted by his laughter or his lies. It breathed differently now, cleaner, softer. The ghosts that lingered had names, but they no longer had power. And as the first snow fell gently on the roof, I stood at the threshold, watching the world turn white again, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Spring returned, as quietly as winter had left. I walked out one morning and saw the first green buds on the dogwood tree by the fence line. It felt like the mountain was exhaling, the way the earth does when it's no longer carrying something heavy. I suppose I was too. The betrayal, the loss, the slow path to reclamation. It had all settled into the soil of who I was now, stronger, quieter, sharper, and more at peace than I'd ever been. I never told anyone the full story, not because I was hiding it, but because some victories are meant to be lived in, not spoken about. The cabin became more than a home again. It became a boundary, a place that reminded me of what I'd survived, and how I'd done it without losing my mind, my dignity, or my voice. I started inviting people back. Old friends, my sister's kids. They didn't know the full depth of what had happened, and they didn't need to. All they saw was a man who had taken care of something sacred. Sometimes I still get letters addressed to Martian, junk mail, legal notices. I toss them without reading. That part of my life has no address here anymore. The man who once tried to erase me from my own inheritance is now a ghost, drifting through borrowed shelters. And I'm standing in the house I built with bare hands and quiet resolve. Redemption didn't come in the form of payback. It came in the form of discipline. It came in the choice to heal with action, not words. It came in the silence after the storm, the kind of silence that says, I'm still here, and I'm still standing. The kind of silence that men like Martin never learn to respect until it's too late. I don't hate him. I just see him clearly now. A man whose own emptiness was louder than any love he could offer. A man who mistook control for care, possession for protection. But I am not him. I didn't let his smallness shrink me. I let it define the borders I would never cross. That's the real win. My name is Evan Blackwood. I'm 42 years old. And this cabin isn't just mine again. It's more than a piece of land. It's the story of how I reclaimed what was mine, not through vengeance but through quiet, deliberate power. The kind that builds a legacy, one nail, one choice, one silent victory at a time.